It was the evening of Monday, the 21st of December, 1908. Winter had settled upon Glasgow, the city shrouded in coal smoke and early darkness. Gas lamps flickered along West Princes Street in the Woodlands district, an area of substantial stone-built tenements where the prosperous merchant classes made their homes. The clatter of horse-drawn carts had diminished with the hour, and the streets grew quiet. At number 49 West Princes Street, in a spacious first-floor apartment, Miss Marian Gilchrist resided. She was 83 years of age, a lady of considerable fortune inherited from her late father. She lived with her housemaid, Miss Helen Lambie, a young woman who attended to the daily requirements of the household. The apartment was well appointed, furnished with heavy mahogany pieces, thick carpets, and curtains drawn against the December chill. Upon the mantelpiece, a clock marked the passing hours. In the wardrobe lay jewellery valued at £3,000, concealed from common view. That evening, as darkness settled fully upon the city, Miss Lambie departed the apartment to purchase a newspaper for her mistress, a task she performed most evenings. She would be absent for scarcely 10 minutes. In that brief interval, violence entered the respectable household, and a life would be taken in the most brutal fashion. Oscar Joseph Leschziner was born on the 8th of January, 1872, in the city of Oppeln, Upper Silesia, which at that time formed part of the German Empire. After the Second World War, the city would become part of Poland and return to its original Slavic name of Opol. His father worked as a baker, and the young Oscar enjoyed a modest upbringing within a Jewish family. The city sat upon the banks of the Oder River, a place of commerce and trade for many centuries past. In 1893, when he was 21 years of age, Oscar departed his homeland and travelled to England. Many young men had emigrated illegally from Germany to avoid compulsory military service. Some travelled to the United States, but Britain also proved a favourable destination. The country was among the leading economies in Europe, a prominent industrial power, offering employment to those willing to seek it. There existed also a substantial Jewish community in London. He settled in the capital, but did not pursue a professional occupation. Instead, he worked as a bookmaker. Gambling was considered an important element of Victorian working-class leisure, particularly popular among the residents of the East End. Betting houses had existed in London for many years, accepting small wages and providing swift payment to winners. When such establishments were made illegal, the trade moved into public houses and onto the city streets. Bookmakers employed runners to collect bets and pay out winnings, and lookouts who would warn of approaching policemen. Oscar worked under many aliases, most notably Oscar Anderson, but he eventually adopted the name Slater for official purposes. His occupation brought him to the attention of the police. In 1896, he was arrested and charged with alleged malicious wounding. This was followed by a second arrest in 1897 on a charge of assault. On both occasions, he was acquitted. In 1899, he moved northward to Scotland, settling in the capital city of Edinburgh. He dressed well and gave the impression of being a fine gentleman, claiming variously to be a dentist and somewhat of an expert in precious stones. His true income, however, appeared to derive from gambling. After 2 years in Edinburgh, he moved to Glasgow, where he became known to the constabulary as one suspected of running an illegal betting operation. Oscar Slater had been married, but the union proved unsuccessful. His wife was reported to be a heavy drinker, and he left her. He subsequently began a relationship with a young French woman named Miss André Antoine. While Oscar continued his work taking bets and gambling, Miss Antoine earned her income by entertaining gentlemen callers. The Street Betting Act was passed by Parliament in 1906, rendering such operations explicitly illegal. Many working-class people, however, continued to place regular wagers with bookmakers in their houses or on the streets. The constabulary seemed reluctant to enforce the new legislation with vigour. Oscar continued his activities, moving through Glasgow, known to police, but not arrested. By 1908, he resided at St George's Road, not far from the Woodlands district. He maintained the appearance of a gentleman, well-dressed and confident in his bearing. To his neighbours, he presented himself as a man of business, though the precise nature of that business remained unclear. He was 37 years of age. Miss Marian Gilchrist, meanwhile, lived her quiet existence at 15 Queen's Terrace West, which adjoined West Princes Street. She was a lady of advanced years and considerable wealth. Her father had left her a large fortune, and she lived comfortably with her maid in the first-floor apartment. The dwelling was spacious, comprising several rooms furnished in the manner befitting a woman of her station. She possessed an extensive collection of jewellery, which she kept hidden in her wardrobe. The collection was valued at £3,000, a substantial sum. She was known to be cautious, even fearful, regarding the security of her possessions. She had previously arranged with her neighbour below, a gentleman named Mr. Arthur Adams, who lived with his sisters, that, should she ever require assistance, she would knock upon the floor. He had assured her he would come at once. In the weeks leading to December of 1908, there had been a visitor to the building. Someone had called at Miss Gilchrist's door, seeking a person named Anderson. The records do not show whether this visitor was admitted or what transpired during the visit. The name Anderson, however, would later prove significant. On the 19th of December, 1908, Oscar Slater made arrangements to travel to the United States. He and Miss Antoine booked passage on the steamship Lusitania, departing from Liverpool. They would travel under the names Mr. and Mrs. Otto Sandow. On the evening of Monday, the 21st of December, 1908, at approximately 7 o'clock, Miss Helen Lambie departed the apartment at 49 West Princes Street to purchase a newspaper for her mistress. It was a routine errand, one she performed most evenings, and she expected to be absent for no more than 10 minutes. In the ground-floor apartment, Mr. Arthur Adams sat with his sisters. At approximately 7:15, they heard 3 distinct knocks upon the ceiling. Adams recalled the arrangement Miss Gilchrist had made, that she would signal if she required assistance. Encouraged by his sisters, he hurried upstairs to the first floor. He found the door to Miss Gilchrist's apartment closed and rang the bell. There was no answer. He could hear faint sounds from within, unusual noises that caused him concern. Uncertain, he returned briefly to his own apartment. His sisters insisted he return immediately to check upon their elderly neighbour. As he ascended the stairs once more, he encountered Miss Lambie returning with the newspaper. She unlocked the door, and together they entered the apartment. A gentleman appeared in the hallway, well-dressed and composed. He walked past them without haste and descended the stairs to the street. Miss Lambie appeared surprised, but not alarmed. She proceeded to the kitchen, then to one of the bedrooms, searching for her mistress. She then entered the dining room. Miss Marian Gilchrist lay face down upon the floor, blood flowing from severe wounds to her head. Mr. Adams rushed into the street, seeking assistance. He fetched his doctor and alerted the constabulary. When the doctor arrived and examined Miss Gilchrist, he confirmed that she had died from blows to the head. The police examined the scene. There was no sign of forced entry, which suggested the attacker may have been known to the deceased or had been admitted by her. In the bedroom, a box of matches was found and a gaslight had been lit. Papers were scattered about the room and a small box had been forced open. The constabulary suspected that robbery had been the motive for the crime. Although Miss Gilchrist possessed jewellery worth £3,000 concealed in her wardrobe, it appeared that only a crescent-shaped diamond brooch was missing. The police asked Miss Lambie and Mr. Adams for information about the gentleman they had seen leaving the apartment. They provided similar, though not identical, descriptions. A medical examination was conducted by a physician who determined that Miss Gilchrist had died from repeated blows to the head delivered with a blunt instrument. The injuries were severe, indicating considerable force had been applied. The nature of the wounds suggested a heavy object had been used, though the murder weapon was not recovered at the scene. The police continued their investigation. 2 days after the murder, on the 23rd of December, a young girl of 14 years, named Miss Mary Barrowman, came forward. She claimed that she had also seen the gentleman leaving the building on the evening of the murder. She stated that he had been in such haste that he nearly collided with her upon the pavement. Her description of the man, however, differed significantly from the descriptions provided by Miss Lambie and Mr. Adams. On the following day, the 24th of December, another witness came forward with information. The police were informed that a gentleman who lived at St. George's Road, in close proximity to Miss Gilchrist's residence, was in possession of a pawn ticket for a diamond brooch. The constabulary knew that a brooch had been taken during the attack. The gentleman's name was Oscar Slater, though he was known primarily by the name Oscar Slater. The police visited the home of Mr. Slater, but were informed by the servants that on the 21st of December, Oscar had been at home throughout the evening. The servants also reported that Mr. Slater and his companion, Miss André Antoine, had departed Glasgow and travelled to Liverpool, where they had boarded the steamship Lusitania, bound for New York. They had not travelled under their real names, but had instead used the aliases Mr. and Mrs. Otto Sandow. The police conducted further inquiries and discovered that the brooch at the pawnshop had been deposited there some time before the murder, and was entirely different from the brooch that had been stolen from Miss Gilchrist. Nevertheless, the constabulary continued to regard Mr. Oscar Slater as a credible suspect. If you are finding this case as compelling as we are, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us continue researching and sharing these forgotten stories from history. We also read every comment, so let us know your thoughts on this case below. Now, let us continue. A warrant for the arrest of Oscar Slater was issued. The New York police were contacted, and an extradition application was prepared. The steamship Lusitania arrived in New York on the 2nd of January, 1909. Mr. Oscar Slater was arrested upon disembarkation and taken to the Tombs prison. The Scottish newspapers, believing the case resolved, published a photograph of the suspect. Following this publication, additional witnesses came forward, claiming they had seen the same gentleman in the vicinity of West Princes Street on the evening of the 21st of December. It appeared unusual that these witnesses had only come forward after the suspect's photograph had been printed, and a reward of £200 had been offered. Miss Adams, Miss Lambie, and Miss Mary Barrowman were asked to accompany detectives to New York. When they arrived, the two young women identified Oscar Slater as the gentleman they had witnessed leaving Miss Gilchrist's property. Mr. Adams, however, was not convinced that he was the gentleman whom he had seen. Mr. Oscar Slater was advised that the extradition application would likely not succeed. He felt considerable distress at being accused of such a terrible crime, and voluntarily agreed to return to Scotland in order to clear his name. The press reported the news of his return to Glasgow with great interest. Columns were devoted to accounts of his life, informing readers that he had left Germany to avoid military service, and emphasizing that he was Jewish, at a time when anti-Jewish sentiments had been increasing. The press seemed convinced of his guilt. The fact that he returned to Scotland voluntarily did little to persuade anyone that he might be innocent. The police searched his luggage and discovered a small hammer. They considered this might be the murder weapon, though some experts advised that the hammer was too small to have inflicted the wounds observed upon Miss Gilchrist. In February of 1909, witnesses who had allegedly seen a gentleman in the Queen's Terrace area on the 21st of December were asked to attend an identity parade. Most selected Oscar Slater. All, however, had previously seen his photograph in the newspapers. Mr. Oscar Slater was formally charged with murder. The trial of Oscar Slater commenced in Edinburgh on the 3rd of May 1909. It was presided over by Lord Guthrie. Miss Lambie and Miss Barrowman were both called as witnesses and testified that the defendant was the gentleman they had seen that night. Mr. Adams, who had been unable to identify Mr. Slater as the person he had seen leaving Miss Gilchrist's apartment, was not called to give evidence. The prosecution outlined the manner in which the defendant conducted his affairs and created the impression that he was a dubious character who made his living by illegal and immoral means. The public was fascinated by the case, and as the trial progressed, they grew more convinced of Mr. Oscar Slater's guilt. The prosecution, however, was unable to produce any physical evidence connecting the defendant to the crime. There were no fingerprints upon any surface at the scene. No blood-stained clothing was discovered. There remained also the question of why only a brooch had been taken when valuable jewellery worth £3,000 had been left untouched in the wardrobe. The defence presented testimony from Miss André Antoine and from the servants, all of whom stated that Oscar had been at home on the evening of the murder. The prosecution reminded the jury that Miss Antoine was a woman who earned her income by entertaining gentlemen callers, and therefore was not someone whose testimony could be trusted. The defence also demonstrated that the journey to New York had been arranged long before the crime had taken place, and that the brooch in the pawn shop was not the one that had belonged to Miss Gilchrist. When the trial concluded, Lord Guthrie summed up the case. In his address to the jury, he stated that a man of this kind had not the presumption of innocence in his favour. When the jury returned, they found the defendant guilty by a majority of 9 votes to 6, with 5 jurors finding the case not proven and 1 believing Oscar to be not guilty. Lord Guthrie sentenced Oscar Slater to death. The date of his execution was set for the 27th of May, 1909. There existed no right to appeal a court decision in Scotland at that time. The defence lawyers organised a petition which soon gained more than 20,000 signatures. The Secretary of State for Scotland, Lord Pentland, came under considerable pressure to commute the sentence. 2 days before Oscar was due to be hanged, his sentence was changed to life imprisonment. Despite the press and the public having been very much against Oscar Slater during his trial, as he began to serve his sentence at Peterhead Prison, there were those who started to question his guilt. In 1910, a Scottish lawyer and criminologist named William Ruffhead published The Trial of Oscar Slater, which highlighted the weaknesses in the case the prosecution had presented. 2 years later, in 1912, the author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, published a document entitled The Case of Oscar Slater. In it, he concluded that Oscar should be pardoned and released. He considered that the murderer had been searching for specific documents, perhaps Miss Gilchrist's will, and that robbery had not been the true motive. This would explain why only a brooch was taken from the property. In 1914, a private inquiry into the case was ordered by the politician Thomas Mackinnon Wood. A detective named John Thompson Trench, who had worked on the original investigation in 1908, provided information which had allegedly been deliberately concealed from the trial by the police. The inquiry, however, found that the conviction was sound. Detective Trench was dismissed from the force and prosecuted on charges from which he was eventually acquitted. He died in 1919, aged 50 years, and never lived to see justice done. Time passed. The First World War commenced in 1914 and concluded in 1918. The case of Mr. Oscar Slater was now barely mentioned, and he remained in Peterhead prison, telling anyone who would listen that he was an innocent man. In 1924, Detective John Thompson Trench revealed that on the night of the murder, Miss Lambie had named someone with the initials A.B., not Oscar Slater. When the police received information about the pawned brooch, however, they focused all resources upon Oscar's arrest. In 1925, Oscar smuggled a note from prison via a fellow inmate to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, requesting continued help. Conan Doyle applied for his release, but the request was refused. In 1927, William Park published The Truth About Oscar Slater. The renewed press interest led the Solicitor General for Scotland, Alexander Munro MacRobert, to conclude that Oscar's conviction was no longer proven. On the 8th of November, 1927, a statement was issued. Oscar Slater had completed more than 18.5 years of his sentence and would be released on licence. 6 days later, he walked free from Peterhead prison. On the 8th of June, 1928, 5 judges quashed the original conviction on the grounds that Lord Guthrie had failed to direct the jury properly. Oscar received only £6,000 in compensation for nearly 2 decades of imprisonment. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Oscar Slater met only once. They later had a public disagreement when Conan Doyle requested that Oscar repay legal fees from his compensation. Oscar refused, and the two never spoke again. In 1935, Oscar married Miss Lena Wilhelmina Schad, a Scottish woman of German descent, 30 years his junior. They settled in Ayr, where he sold and repaired antiques. As a German-born man, he and his wife were briefly interned at the start of the Second World War. Most of his family in Germany, including his 2 sisters, were murdered in the Holocaust. Oscar Slater died in Ayr in 1948 of natural causes, aged 76. The murder of Miss Marian Gilchrist remains unsolved. The case led to the establishment of the Scottish Court of Criminal Appeal. In the archives of the High Court of Justiciary, the file remains, a testament to a miscarriage of justice that reshaped Scottish law. West Princes Street still stands in Glasgow, its stone tenements weathered by more than a century of rain. Few who pass number 49 know that within those walls, a crime divided a nation and destroyed an innocent man's life.